I've entitled this message, The Drama of Two Sleepless Men. Now, last time I preached, we considered briefly the account of the way that the king could not sleep, and we looked briefly at the consequences. But now we're going to look into that event in much greater detail, because when we look at the detail, we shall discover many more examples of the sovereignty of God at work, behind the scenes, if you like. Perhaps those involved are unaware of that. Even Esther and Mordecai are not necessarily aware that God is working behind the scenes to bring things about that favor his glory, fulfill his purpose, and provide redemption and salvation for the Jews threatened by such a dire consequence as Haman had planned. I suggest you have your Bibles open to chapter 6 of Esther, because I will refer to verses without actually quoting them at times. And we have three headings. First of all, the king's problem, that he could not sleep. Secondly, the king's perception, the things the king realized about Haman that he had not previously thought. And finally, Mordecai prevails. The problem, the perception, and the fact that Mordecai prevails. Well, look, first of all, then, at the king's problem. Problem, superficially, was that he could not sleep. And I want to make it clear that that must mean he could not go to sleep. The only alternative would be that he went to sleep in the normal way and woke up, and at that point couldn't go back to sleep, and then called for the Chronicles to be read to him. But you see, that wouldn't really work, because if he went to sleep in the first instance, then it wouldn't be true to say that he could not sleep. So I'm saying that we have to understand this word, this term, go to sleep, as meaning the meaning of the verse. And I'm going to put an arbitrary time on the time when the king called for the Chronicles to be read to him. Now, I can justify that quite closely, actually, but I don't have time to do that. But basically, the king would have gone to bed at the normal time, but he didn't go to sleep. And no doubt, he tried to get to sleep for some time before he gave up and called in some assistants, called in one of his scribes to read to him from the Chronicles, the book of the Chronicles. Now, this book of the Chronicles was a written record of eventful things that had taken place within the entire empire. It was a record of things that were so notable or so significant, politically or socially or whatever reason, that it was worth preserving them for all time. And we don't know exactly how long this book had been kept, but we do know that the passage that we're dealing with here, that is the way Mordecai the Jew saved the king's life by uncovering a plot to murder him, we know that that must have happened at least 2 years before the events we're looking at now. It could have been 4 years, but other parts of the text of the book of Esther do put some restrictions on that range. So here we have something that's 2 years old, at least, and we have it read from the book. The book of the Chronicles, as I said earlier on, was a permanent record of events of interest and concern and significance throughout the whole empire. And it would have been published on a regular basis. It might have been published daily, or perhaps once a week. I can't imagine that it would be left any longer than that, because in this vast empire, there must have been things of significance happening all the time. So there was a time when the king eventually gave up trying to sleep and called in help, the help of a scribe, no doubt, to read from the Chronicles. Now, why he did that, I don't know. Perhaps he thought that the Chronicles were going to be so boring that they'd send him to sleep. He could have called for his musicians, perhaps, to play soft music until he fell asleep. But he called for the Chronicles to be read. And he did not obviously choose which passage to read, because his surprise and embarrassment is evidently recorded when he discovered that he had omitted to reward Mordecai for this act of faithfulness and kindness that saved his life. And he was obviously very upset at that, so clearly he did not ask them to read that passage. Probably forgot the passage was there, 2 years old. Furthermore, the scribe would have had no reason for picking out that passage particular, no reason whatever. So I think we have to conclude that it was a random choice. It was random. You know, sometimes you open a book at any page and see what's on it. Some people who do that with the Bible. I don't recommend it. There's a story told, whether it's true or not, but there was a man who thought he would get guidance from God by opening his Bible randomly at any page and closing his eyes, putting his finger on the page, and then finding what verse was under his finger. And he did this one day, and his finger came up with the verse, "He went and hanged himself," referring to Judas. Oh dear, that's not a very nice bit of guidance, so I'll try again. So he tried again, different page, different finger position, that is, and it said, "Go thou and do likewise." He gave up his practice. Anyway, it's not a way to find God's guidance. You've got to know your Bible. You've got to read your Bibles intelligently and carefully. But in any case, this was a random choice of the scribe from a book that must have numbered at least several hundred pages. It's been going on for at least 2 years, maybe more, a lot more, perhaps, and being published daily or weekly, even if it had been published monthly, which is a bit unlikely, I think, there would have still been hundreds of pages to choose from. So here is a random choice of readings that was organized by God. No question about that. Now, the interesting thing is that when the king was told that Mordecai had not been rewarded or honored, he acted immediately in the middle of the night. Now, it's midnight, we're suggesting midnight, or sometime after midnight. He said, "This can't wait until morning." There's so many things he could have done. He could have asked his servants to look after it, take care of it. You go away and give something to Mordecai to reward him. King could have decided on the spot what to give. He could have said, well, give him £1,000 or the equivalent of that as a financial reward, or we'll write him a certificate that he can frame and hang on his wall to say he did this thing. There are so many things the king could have done. But the king not only demanded immediate action, or he also was half afraid to make a decision. Now, we've found that King Ahasuerus, throughout the pages, the chapters that we've studied, was always reluctant to make decisions for himself. He was always turning to advisors and helpers to make the decision for him, basically. It was a weakness, clearly. And that's what happened here, I think. when he said, we must do something straight away, he then said something that otherwise would not make a lot of sense. He called for help in making this decision, because he says, who is in the court? We've got to do something about this. We've got to remedy this omission. And then his next words were, who is in the court? Why should you say that? Well, I think there's only one answer to that. The courtyard was a place where petitioners from all over the empire came to seek an audience with the king. Now, very few of them actually made it into the king's presence, but there must have been in the courtyard a number of senior civil servants, if you like, senior people, reliable people who would vet the case and the plea of those who came into the courtyard and decide whether they were worthy of being allowed to go in and see the king in person. I think the vast majority of the petitions and pleas and needs brought from all over the empire into that courtyard were dealt with satisfactorily by these senior civil servants and never needed to be forwarded to the king. Who is in the courtyard? He doesn't say, is anyone in the courtyard? He knew there were people in the courtyard who could help him make this decision. And he was thinking, he could only have been thinking of these senior civil servants who were obviously running a 24-hour service. In other words, they were in shifts, of course, but they were always some senior people, reliable people, people who had the power to decide whether a petitioner could go and see the king or not go and see the king. These people were there. I don't know how many of them, but certainly a small team would be on duty at any time of the day and night. So the king knew there were people in the courtyard who could help him with his decision as to what to do. And it was a complete surprise to the king to hear that Haman was there. Because Haman was the prime minister. He didn't need to be in the courtyard. He ought to have been in bed, preparing himself for a busy day on the following day. There was absolutely no need for Haman to be there. He must have had a daily appointment with the king to discuss matters of state. So he almost certainly had an appointment fixed to see the king later in the day. So why had he crept into the courtyard without the king's knowledge? And the king wondered why he was there. Well, now, let's switch for a moment. Let's turn the searchlight from the king, who could not sleep, to Haman himself. Now, the day leading up to these events, this evening, this night when the king couldn't sleep, the day leading up to that had been a very busy day for Haman. It started with the first feast that Esther had held, with Haman and the king as her only guests. Now, as we saw last time I spoke, Esther's reason for holding this feast was to find out more about the king, more about Haman, trying to find out what they thought in private and what they said in private when they were not in an official situation. And she was listening. She was watching. She particularly wanted to know what the chemistry was between the king and Haman, how they got on together, because that would direct to some degree what she did in seeking the king's help in dealing with Haman. Haman, of course, thought that this feast was almost in his honor because he and the king were the only guests. And so he was very proud about that. And that pre-feast must have happened that must have been a lunch feast, about midday, shall we say, because it takes quite a time to prepare a feast, even for 3 people. The invitation had to go out to Haman, and so on. So they had to know. They were there probably at lunchtime, and then being a feast, it would have gone on for some time. And then immediately he left the feast. He went back home, and he called his family, his friends, and his advisors. It's quite a crowd of people called to come to his house to hear him speak. And that would have taken time. They didn't have mobile phones in those days. And so messengers would have to go out to each and every one of those invited to Haman's house to hear Haman. And of course, what Haman wanted to do was to boast about his attainments. And that he did. He must have spent some time. We've got to read back to the previous chapter to find out what it was he said. But that's in chapter 5 and verses 9 to 14. He had to call these people together because he was so pleased with himself that he regaled them and told them of his riches, of his wealth, of his preferment in government, of his powers, and everything he has done that he considered was a good thing. And he was there simply to boast of his own fame. And to cap it all, he said, I was the only one invited, beside the king, to Queen Esther's feast. That was obviously a big feather in my cap. And so he must have spent considerable time telling all these gathered people how wonderful he was. And then he added one thing. He said, well, there's one thing that really upsets me, that Mordecai, the Jew, who sits in the king's gate, will not pay me honor, will not bow the knee to me as I pass by. Everybody had been commanded to do that by the king, that Haman should be honored in a way that normally only the king himself would be honored. And Mordecai refuses to do that. He said, I can pay honor only to God. I can bow the knee only to God, not to man, any man, whoever that person is. And this really upset Haman. And in spite of being so proud of himself, he was very sad about this. And so his wife and his friends and advisors, all of them, got together at that meeting, the end of that meeting, and said, well, you can get rid of Mordecai any time you like. In the morning, so it must have been quite late at night, you see, after office hours for the king, he said, in the morning, go to the king and ask him to execute Mordecai on the grounds of insubordination. He won't bow to me. And so confident were they that this would happen, the king would do exactly what Haman wanted him to do, they built a gallows 50 cubits high, cubit possibly about 18 inches. And they built it in their own garden, and that must have taken time. They would have got workmen in to do it and prepare it for hanging Mordecai the next morning. And at that time, obviously, it was late at night, and that is why his wife said, in the morning, you can't go to the king tonight. The king may be in bed already. We don't know. But in the morning, he'll do what you want him to do. Well, of course, that obviously made life very difficult for Haman, because he was afraid that the king, who had given permission for the massacre of the Jews, he was afraid the king might change his mind. And Ahasuerus was known to be able very quickly to have second thoughts about things that he had agreed to. And so Haman, instead of going to bed at that time, instead of doing what his wife said, wait till the morning, he set off instead for the palace. And you see now the coincidence of times. Haman, instead of going to bed and waiting till the morning, not knowing anything about what was happening at the palace in the king's bedroom, he went from his house over to the palace, and he went into the courtyard. We're told that explicitly. At precisely the time that the king asked the question, who is in the courtyard? I want somebody to come in and help me make this decision about rewarding Mordecai. And he must have been completely shaken by the fact that Haman was there. They told him, Haman is here. He said, well, what's he doing there? Why is he there? Why didn't I know about this? Why has he crept in? Is he plotting something that he's not telling me about? And so the king said, send him in. And this comes to my second point, the king's perception. Haman could not wait. For whatever reason, he couldn't wait till the morning. And instead of going to bed, he entered the palace court, and that must have been around the same time as the sleepless king sent for help to those in the courtyard. You see the coincidence of time there. If Haman had waited till the morning, none of this would have happened. None of what follows would have happened. And he was in the courtyard, and the king began to wonder what he was doing there and worry about what he was doing there. And that would have been at our arbitrary time, around about midnight or sometime after midnight. But the point was that the king asked for help in making this decision about rewarding the Jew Mordecai. At that very time, Haman turned up in the courtyard. Now, we have two sleepless men, not just one. If he had waited till the morning, of course, his plan to execute Mordecai could not have happened, because the king is looking for some way to reward Mordecai. But at least Haman himself would not have been humiliated in the way that he was, because he was present when the king called for help. Now, there's an interesting thing here, isn't it? Why ever did the king ask them to send Haman into him rather than one of the civil servants? He knew Mordecai was a Jew, and he knew that Haman hated the Jews and had put out this edict for their massacre. He's the last person you would have chosen to help you choose a reward for Mordecai. And the king should perhaps, logically speaking, have passed Haman by. Can't possibly ask him, who hates the Jews, to come and help me reward a Jew. So I'll pass him by, I'll get one of the other men in. But he didn't. He deliberately asked for Haman to be sent. He deliberately chose the most unsuitable helper, knowing that Haman hated the Jews and that Mordecai was a Jew. Well, now, why did he do this? Why did the king do this? Well, I think he did it quite deliberately. He was testing Haman's loyalty. He had already been shaken by the first feast earlier that day that Esther had held, because by implication, we don't know what was said at that feast, but he went home immediately. Remember, Haman went home immediately and started boasting to all his friends and advisors and family. So I think it's very likely that perhaps unwittingly Haman had allowed some of that boastfulness, some of that self-pride to leak out during the Esther's feast. And I think the king was beginning to worry about Haman. He had trusted him absolutely up to this point, but he was beginning to worry. And he thought, well, this is an opportunity to get Haman in and see how he reacts to this question of rewarding Mordecai. But then you see, looking at Haman's pride here, the king, when he had his visitor come in to help him, he didn't identify the man in whom the king delights. Now, if one of the civil servants had come in, the king would have said, look, how can we reward this man Mordecai? He wouldn't have had to conceal from them the identity of the person he's talking about and he wants to reward. Why did he use this strange circumlocution, as is talking round the subject? And he asks, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? He must have done it to avoid identifying Mordecai, because he wants to see how Haman is going to respond. Now, what kind of response would you have expected? The king makes this rather strange and lengthy description to avoid identifying the person. What would he have expected from a completely impartial helper? Well, the impartial helper would, I think, before making any suggestions of what the reward should be, that person would ask some questions of the king. He said, well, I would love to help you make the decision, but you need to tell me something about the person you're going to reward in case I make a silly suggestion. For example, I might recommend some feminine perfume, thinking that the person, it didn't man, but person, thinking the person might be a woman. Or he might have given some trivial reward or suggested some trivial reward for some high-ranking general, or a financial reward for some extremely rich person. You see, if the helper who came in to help the king make the decision didn't know what kind of person was to be rewarded, they could very easily make a silly suggestion and earn the king's laughter, if you like, mockery, or even worse, earn the king's displeasure at making such a unsuitable suggestion. So any normal person would say, well, yes, what sort of person are we talking about? What kind of person are we going to reward? Well, he puts the question to Haman. But instead of making that sensible reply, asking what kind of person, Haman immediately assumes that he must be the person, that he is the only possible person that the king would be delighting in. And so on that assumption, based upon his arrogant pride, he presents this amazing, bizarre suggestion. And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. He'd fallen into the king's trap. And the king replies. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and you do so for Mordecai the Jew. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So Haman had to do that. he had to, the very man he wanted to execute the following morning, that very man was going to ride the horse. And the horse was not going to be led by some equerry, some stable boy. It was going to be led by one of the choicest, highest ranking people in the land, one of the king's princes. And of course, Haman was one of those princes. And so the king twisted the knife in the wound, if you like, by saying, yes, you can lead the horse. You must lead the horse. You're a prince. You said a prince should lead the horse, then you should lead it. And without any question, of course, the person who rides the horse is a superior person to the one who leads it. And he had to do that. He had to proclaim that his bitterest enemy was the man in whom the king delights to honor. And he had to do that publicly. Had to parade through the city square. This is the town, not just the palace, the city of Shushan. He had to go there and parade through the streets, shouting out, this is the man that the king delights to honor. Give him honor, give him praise. And, of course, Haman was bitterly humiliated. The king could have chosen some other prince, couldn't he? He could have spared Haman the humiliation. But he didn't. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to humiliate Haman, teach him a lesson, if you like, to give him notice, if you like, that he is not the king. But worse than that, I think the king saw in Haman's proposal not only a way of honoring Haman, but a hint of Haman's desire one day to be king, to take over control from the king, to depose the king and take his place. And I think the king was not only angry, but frightened. And so it happened that the king maximizes Haman's disgrace over this incident. We're going to continue from there next time. But I hope you can see the string of consequences that flowed from God's organizing this meeting, this midnight meeting between the king and Haman, and caused Haman to boast in the way that he did and to reveal his inner thoughts of seeking to be preferred above the king. Well, we shall see what follows from that next time.